Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you about new words and new ways to think about this amazing juncture we're at as a species, as individuals. I mean, our generation, in our lives, enormously consequential phenomena are unfolding that are doing. And it's a really different way than humans have related to their environment. 99% of our history, the environment did stuff. And we just reacted like climate happened. And we either got out of the way, put on clothes, lit a fire, or died. And now we're affecting the system, not just the climate system, but the Earth system in many ways. And there are these new words that are evolving to deal with that. I'm going to take you to June 2014. The Oxford English Dictionary added 171 words. They do this every quarter. I didn't know this until I started looking into the ideas behind the Anthropocene. And so 2014 was when the Anthropocene made the list. The word was only 14 years old at that time. And the other words that made it in that year were included a bunch of terms you'll never hear, completely exotic, pharmacological things. But there was also selfie. Selfie got into the OED that year, and flexitarian, and pescatarian. So there's probably one in the audience or two. And then there was this word Anthropocene. And by the way, the Brits, as you heard a minute ago, the Brits pronounce it Anthropocene. We pronounce it Anthropocene, so we haven't even figured out how to pronounce the word yet. 99% of the people on the planet, I guarantee, haven't heard the word yet. And what I'm going to try to convey to you in talking about RX for the planet, or prescription for where we're at, is yet another word. Not that we need a new word, but we need some new ideas, I think. And that word is anthropophilia. In other words, a lot of what the history of environmentalism appropriately grew up as being mostly a finger-pointy thing. It was Exxon's fault or someone's fault. And now we're at this moment where it's a lot harder to keep making those arguments given the complexity of who buys the oil that Exxon drills for and that kind of thing. So we're going to, and again, anthropophilia, I'll explain a little bit where my thinking is on that. And it grows out of my own experience, which is as mostly, by the way, the word isn't new. This is the dictionary definition of anthropophilia. I'm not talking about anthropophilia in terms of parasites that prefer humans to other mammals. That's the existing definition of the word, but I think you'll get what I'm talking about. And we do modify words sometimes. So the word bug, something bugs you. Bug used to be kind of like an insect, and then it became kind of a term of critique. So words do evolve too. We'll see. Stay tuned. So yeah, my journey is journalistic, 90% of it. I didn't grow up wanting to be a journalist. I grew up wanting to be a marine biologist. And then I migrated into telling the story of science more than doing science. I've been to the North Pole, the heart of the Amazon rainforest. I've been to the White House. I've been to the Vatican. I'll talk more about that in a minute. What's the science writer doing in the Vatican? It's probably the most important learning I've done as a science journalist happened at the Vatican in 2014. But we'll get there. I don't want to get ahead of myself. And what I realized recently, in looking back on 30 years of reporting on climate change, deforestation, biological conservation, extinction, pollution, policy issues, I've really been reporting on one thing, which is growing pains, the growing pains of the human species. As I said a minute ago, all through history, we just did stuff. And then along come these inconvenient scientists and who say, hey, you're doing stuff that's having lasting impacts on things that we care about, whether it's a coral reef or the climate. And this is sort of the vital signs of the planet. You look at it in terms of different resources, whether it's phosphorus or land use or CO2. CO2, this is the zoom. We've been in zoom mode. Keeling curve is now, every day you can go to this Twitter account or go to the Scripps Institution website and see how we're doing. And this is 1750 till now, and there's something different has started to happen. This is the concentration in the atmosphere. It's an enduring gas. Once you take a chunk of coal and combust it, you're adding fundamentally stuff that was locked in the ground for millions of years into circulation for at least tens of thousands of years, thousands of years. So that's why it accumulates. It's like filling a bathtub faster than it's draining. And that's what's happening, but look at this, the pace of change. So you can look at this, and as many have, and as I have, and say, oh my God, this is a page one story, and which I've written many of, but there's complexities here too. How much of this is someone's fault, or how much of this is kind of just a fundamental moment for us as a species is still for debate. There's not much so far that distinguishes us from bacteria. We're not listening to science yet. We've been, there's stuff there in bacteria. You probably did this exercise in high school or something. You smear something on a plate of agar, and bacteria grow until feedback mechanisms limit their growth. Do we have to have that happen? Does nature have to enforce our limits, or can we use we're named Homo sapiens, but are we sapient enough to get ahead of that curve? It's still an open question. As I said, scientists have been kind of the finger-pointy adult in the room in some ways. And this is the third release of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report in 2007 in Paris. And Martin Parry is kind of looking and telling us what's happening and the risks. But it reminds me, when I look at this photo, it kind of reminds me of Moses when he came down from the mount with his tablets, And there was a lot of resistance to that messaging at that time as well. And I think scientists and journalists like me have had this overweening expectation that just information magically changes things. And it was a hard learning experience for a journalist to stumble into the social psychology you heard about from others in other contexts to realize, oh, information doesn't often matter. Not just only, it doesn't often doesn't matter. And this is what it reminds me of.
It's not a place for kids.
A minute ago you said you didn't care if he drinks. He said a little drink.
You're tearing me apart!
So we've been a rebel without a cause. We've been the teenager, we meaning society, and the scientists are kind of like Jim Backus's character, chiding his son, you're going to run off the road. But there's a resistance there again. And when I think about this word anthropophilia, I'm starting to think about learning how to embrace that part of us. I mean, it's part of us. It's like you can't sort of just tamp it out. You have to work with it in some way or other. But I'll talk about that more. So in a sense, and I've been writing a lot about the Anthropocene and about the questions it raises about futures and about what we are as a species. And hopefully we can find a way to navigate between the same old and some new goals. And the goals we've had for decades in the environment have been numbers. 350, choose your number. But the traits that can get you toward a number might be the thing that's best to work on. So this is just an articulation of two possibilities. My son's like super slow-mo guys on YouTube. It's this, they just do things, goofy things, like water balloon with a slow-mo camera. They show how it happens in slow motion. Gavin Free and the slow-mo guys took 20,000 match heads and lit them on fire. This is a still frame from their wonderful super slow motion video of what happens when you do that. So are we like a match head just kind of going whoosh? Is that the human experience? Is this it? Are we going to blink out? Or are we, this is Dean Kamen, the inventor of the Segway and many other water filtration systems and stuff. He lives on an island, he has an island mansion, and he has this glowing LED Stonehenge thing. So are we going to glow, or are we going to kind of zoom, boom, and thank you very much on to the next species? That's kind of our moment. That's what our moment is about. But how do you do that? It's not going to be enforceable, I think. So what do you do then? Well, I want to do this as quickly as possible, run through my own Anthropocene journey, which started, you can go to this website, populationaction.org, right now if you have a device, and put in your birth date and find your place on the zoomy curve of us. This was me. I turned 60 this year. So, and look, wow, man, it's all my fault, right? I came around and Zoom. A lot of people came around at that time. It's not just me. Very busy. Yeah, right. So think back to that period, to me as a kid, growing up in suburban Rhode Island, life seemed kind of great. And this is one of the other paradoxes of the Anthropocene, that basically we're doing great. Think about Steven Pinker's book on the reduction of conflict and war, reduction of disease, prolongation of lifespans. All those zoomy curves have come with some really great progressive curves for the human experience. There's lots of work to be done, but we're doing great. So, back in '68, we were doing great too, but there was also this stuff. There was assassinations and war, conflict, and that's, dealing with these paradoxes is interesting. In the environmental movement that I grew up with, it was much, as I said a minute ago, it was like, woe is me. That was one of the big realities, population bomb. And the other was, shame on you, it's somebody's fault. other than me. And a classic example, my own learning moment that I didn't learn until much later came in the forests around my house in Rhode Island. This is one little patch of forest left. And I used to go, I love to walk through that, to get out of suburbia. Like there was this one little spot behind a supermarket where I could walk through the woods and get to a quiet place by this little river. One day I was walking through the woods and there was a bulldozer there. Remember back then you didn't always have a camera on you. So this is a random picture of a bulldozer. When I was 12, I wasn't, tweeting pictures from the woods. But so there's this bulldozer in what I thought was my woods. It wasn't my property, and so I went back to my house and I scribbled a death threat. And I put it, this was my first environmentalism moment. And I put it on that bulldozer seat and it said something like, he who defiles these woods will burn and, have a horrible death or something like that. It was kind of a teenage version of a death threat. And I regret it now. But, at that time I didn't realize, of course, that just 10 years earlier there had been a bulldozer that had created the suburban development where I was living. So what made this bulldozer terrible and the one that created the suburban playground that I lived in okay? Interesting question. I wish I had known it at the time. I went to college and I learned some stuff. I learned how to make sculptures out of snow, which was fun. But I really learned from René Dubos. I was exposed to his writing. I hope some of you go back and think about it. He was a microbiologist, brilliant, came up with one of the first antibiotics. But he wrote wonderfully about the fact that human landscapes don't necessarily have to be travesties and terrible, that the human experience doesn't always tend to result in despoliation. And you look at the Balinese management of water. It goes back thousands of years. You go to Bali and people live in these amazingly beautiful landscapes. They're totally human, totally anthropogenic, but function or biodiverse. Interesting. And then I had this ridiculously lucky moment where I got a fellowship that allowed me to study in the South Pacific. I wish everyone could. And I went to this little village and there was no electricity. I learned about simplicity, large family size. And I went back there 10 years later and the kids had mostly moved to the city, Papeete, and looking for jobs, and instead were finding drugs and alcohol. And then I got onto a boat, and this is what made me want to be a journalist. I mean, I'd grown up sailing, but in little boats in Rhode Island. But I sailed from 2/3 of the way around the world at the age of 22, 23, just as crew on this boat. It was unbelievable. And this is the kind of thing, this is what that experience is like. When you live on a small boat, in the big ocean, you start to feel that sense of that humans are a limited part of the big landscape. It's amazing. But I learned about stuff like this. This was leopard skins in Djibouti, 1980. And they were being sold to French soldiers who were the only thing in Djibouti at that time was French military establishment. And that struck me as fundamentally unsustainable. I said, oh, gosh, got to get busy. And so that's what drew me to journalism. I started writing about our relationship to the climate system. And it started with nuclear winter, 1988, global warming. Basically everything I've written about global warming, I wrote in 1988. It's just been a little elaborations on the ideas since then. But I wrote this book in 1992, and this is why I've been focused on this Anthropocene thing. Back then, I kind of predicted it. The formal proposal for an Anthropocene came around in 2000. 1992, I said, hey, we're leaving the Holocene, this era that we've been in since the end of the last ice age. I just was proposing it in a very informal way. We're heading towards something fundamentally new. Let's call it the Anthropocene. I got the spelling. The spelling was not the kind of spelling you would want in a permanent word. Stay tuned. So I'm actually on the Anthropocene working group because of this. This group of people are making a more formal decision. But I want to get past this quickly. There are artists, you'll hear more about artists who are focused on this, but Robin Woolston is one who has articulated something really important in this. Like, is this going to be a good thing? Is it a bad thing? This human moment, remember, life is getting better for most people. But on different time scales, we're changing things in such profound ways. I approached it as a journalist. Climate change, is a hard story to get into a newspaper because newspapers are about the moment, and climate change is about decades, generations, centuries of change, and it's hard. So that's what led me to blogging. But blogging led me to people doing this, yep. And that led me to behavioral work. as you heard earlier, that normalized for me what some of that yelling is about. A lot of that yelling is about fundamentally different filters that we have for information. And that actually it relaxed me. Go to this one website, culturalcognition.net, for one example of the kind of science that points to this. People who have good intentions on climate change can have divergent views. George Monbiot and Bill McKibben are both climate activists. George looked at Fukushima and said, he's in England, and he said, that means nuclear power isn't completely destructible, even with a terrible earthquake. So we need to use it because climate change is such a big risk. Bill says, go small. Who's right or wrong? I mean, they're both pursuing the same thing. There is no we. This is something I learned in covering this issue on a global scale. That's my sister's kitchen in New York City. Best place to live in the world if you want to be energy efficient, modern person is New York City. But there's a fundamental difference between that and the 2 billion or so people who are cooking on charcoal or dung or firewood. So there's no we when it comes to energy. So does that mean we're stuck with like this? Is this the human experience? Actually, this year, the election makes it think maybe it is. But I think not. I think not. I'm going to fast forward. There's the same social psychology work shows you that people who diverge powerfully on something like global warming, there's no red and blue states. Where's all our red and blue maps? Here, this is on adults who support regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. There's no states. How did that happen? And here's a support for funding research in renewable energy. There's no. You don't hear that in our discourse, but you can. I'm going to skip this. And so diversity is us. These are people who are pursuing fundamentally different ideas of how to get to global warming under control. Jim Hansen, Bill Gates, nuclear power proponents. I have lots of young friends who want to go small and distributed, and they're all right in the sense that there's no single solution. The Pope put it best in his encyclical. And this is where that comes in. He said, reflection should identify possible future scenarios. There is not only one possible solution. Here's the ultimate father figure, the Pape, telling the world, work it out, essentially. He laid out his anti-capitalist personal feelings, but then he pulls back and says, work it out, everybody, which I think is a hopeful thing. Vatican in 2014, I'm going to end here. I was sitting at a table, I was there at this meeting on sustainable humanity. How does that happen? I was sitting next to Walter Munk, who's an oceanographer who was 96 at the time, and who helped win World War II, among other things, by figuring out how to forecast waves going onto beaches. And we're sitting there, and I said, hey, Walter, so after a week of this meeting, what's going to do it? What do you see, Walter Munk, great oceanographer, physical oceanographer? And he's, I'm thinking he's going to say a fusion or some burst of research or a great breakthrough in some technology. And he paused and he says, it'll take a miracle of love and unselfishness. And I thought, wow. And I've written about that a lot. And that's why I think the value in that meeting was that you had theologians, engineers, economists, activists for labor rights and slums, scientists, a couple of journalists, all getting together, working it out in a way that I think is the best path toward a variegated but positive result. Thank you. Great.
Would you like to take a couple of brief questions if people have them?
If there are, this is a very quick sketch of
I know it's a very complicated topic, but if there's anything on anybody's mind that they want to ask. Yes.
So I really hate the climate denial phrase because it sounds like Holocaust denier, and hopefully that's not the discussion you're having because I've done science for 40 years. So here's the question. I mean, it's sort of a bold statement question. The ice age came where you're standing now, it's 2 feet thick, 2 miles thick with ice, and it all melted with no people around. So other things can affect the climate besides people.
Absolutely.
The climate's changing. I like to say if the train's coming at you, you can do 2 things. You can either commit a study on how trains affect the human body, or he could get out of the way.
Yeah, well, in this
So
case,
that was how you
yeah.
started your talk.
Yeah.
And humans have been reacting to the environment since there have been humans, and the environment's always changed. So what's different?
It's, well, the enduring nature of some of the things we're doing to the system now. There were slides I cut out that showed you that there's basically a 10,000-year commitment to certain climate outcomes based on how much we do or don't constrain emissions of carbon dioxide. It's not like the Clean Air Act, as it was invented, was for this soot and stuff that if you put a filter on the smokestack, the problem literally goes away. It's an enduring issue. The reason I show these slides on the lack of energy choices in poor countries is because they need energy, more than they need to worry about climate change. And they are saying to us, like India is saying, we're happy to divert from the coal that we still have in the ground here that you guys burned for 200 years getting wealthy, and we're going to use ours unless you help us find an affordable way to use something else. And those are the real issues. There's tons of uncertainty in the science for anyone to embrace if you want to resist the idea that greenhouse gases endure and are changing climate, and the oceans too. And that's something that I've come to recognize, and I write about that a lot. I don't use the word denier in anything I write because there's denial all around in terms of some people deny that energy transitions take time, for example. You can't just magically decarbonize the economy, and it isn't going to be cheap. And even some very liberal climate writers finally got around to that reality as well. It takes time. So in a sense, I guess what I'm saying is I agree with you. And adaptation and mitigation are a mix. The mix of that is a fundamental part of whatever happens going forward. You have to adapt. We have to actually embrace, as I said, embrace that there's no new normal sea level anymore. For the rest of at least 1,000 years, there'll be no new normal sea level based on the committed warming that's already in the system, unless we use geoengineering to put some kind of parasol in the atmosphere. So these issues don't go away, even when you recognize the problem. It's a wicked problem, and that means engage, find your place in it, on adaptation, on education, on mitigation, on invention, and go forward. But change can happen. I have brought along that 1985 article. Look at this. I want to show you that things can change. A science magazine in 1985, lead advertisement. Yeah, so things can change, but it takes time. Maybe, I don't know. Thank you.